These days, almost nobody thinks they're ignorant. Everyone knows everything, comments on everything, has an opinion about everything. But in practice, what's really growing isn't knowledge. It's the arrogant confidence of people who've never actually stopped to think. We're surrounded by screens, memes, short clips, catchy quotes, and at the same time, surrounded by a comfortable kind of stupidity. People who have access to information but prefer to repeat slogans, who have the internet in their pocket but live trapped in bubbles, who shout "my opinion" as if that were enough to replace an argument. Philosophers noticed this danger long before we did. Arendt talked about the mind that obeys without thinking. Nietzsche warned about the herd that's proud of its own mediocrity. Socrates was killed for asking the worst possible question in a society full of certainties. Are you sure? In this video, we're going to dive into the philosophy of the stupid, not to laugh at other people, but to see where modern stupidity has already slipped into our own lives without asking permission. If that makes you a little uncomfortable, then this is probably exactly where you need to be. You don't need to be cruel to take part in evil. Sometimes, all it takes is simply not thinking. Hannah Arendt, a German philosopher of Jewish origin, watched the 1961 trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the logistical architects of the Holocaust. People expected to see a cold, hateful monster. But what she saw in that courtroom in Jerusalem was an ordinary man, a bureaucrat, an efficient employee, a guy who spoke like anyone else, using stock phrases, institutional cliches, and who kept justifying himself by repeating, "I was just following orders." From that shock came the expression that would become one of the most provocative ideas of the 20th century, the banality of evil. But we could also call it the banality of stupidity. Arendt wasn't saying that evil itself is banal. What she was saying is even more disturbing, that banal, ordinary, normal people are capable of collaborating with the deepest forms of evil, not out of malice, but out of everyday stupidity, out of an inability to think critically, out of their comfort inside structures of obedience and conformity. It was as if, instead of thinking, Eichmann was just repeating cliches, catchphrases and bureaucratic norms. There was no depth. There was no moral judgment. That's the key to the lesson. The problem wasn't hatred. It was the emptiness of thought. Eichmann wasn't a sadist. He was a man with no moral imagination. He couldn't put himself in someone else's shoes. He didn't reflect on the consequences of his actions. His inner world was shallow, filled only with manuals, orders, reports, and rules. He didn't see human beings. He saw numbers. This kind of stupidity, the one that's born out of the laziness to think, is much more dangerous than simple ignorance, because it disguises itself as competence, because it doesn't look evil, just efficient, and because it can operate quietly inside any system. How many modern Eichmanns are sitting behind desks today, carrying out cold decisions without ever questioning the system they serve? How many people just go with the flow, obey the rules, and behave like parts of a machine without ever asking themselves, is this right? Arendt warns us that real moral responsibility is not only about not doing evil, but about refusing to act without thinking, refusing to follow orders blindly, refusing to trade ethical judgment for technical efficiency. What makes this idea even more urgent is that Eichmann, in his own defense, seemed genuinely convinced he hadn't done anything wrong. He was proud of his work. He climbed the ranks, got promoted, received praise. Everything inside the normal logic of bureaucracy. And here is the most disturbing point. Stupidity is not just a lack of intelligence, it's a lack of conscience. Eichmann wasn't incapable of understanding what he was doing. He simply refused to face the horror head-on, hiding behind a mask of normality. He didn't want to think. Thinking hurts. Thinking makes us responsible. How many of us today fall into similar attitudes? How many times do we accept ready-made speeches, repeat what we hear online, obey without questioning, not out of malice, but out of mental exhaustion, fear of going against the crowd, or just to keep our job? This is where the banality of everyday stupidity shows its most current face. Picture an employee who follows an unfair order because that's company policy. Picture a public agent who applies an absurd rule because my hands are tied. Picture someone who shares fake news just because everyone is posting it. The result is the same. Someone contributes to injustice without realizing they're acting unjustly. This is the stupidity Arendt invites us to see. Not as an insult, but as a philosophical diagnosis. Stupidity here is not about being dumb. It's the refusal to think for yourself. The greatest evil in the world is committed by people who never decide to be either good or evil. When Arendt wrote things like this, many people hated her for it. She was accused of going easy on Eichmann. But what she wanted to show was deeper. Evil doesn't need monsters. Evil spreads when thousands of ordinary people decide not to think. And that's still true today, maybe even more. We live in times of algorithms telling us what to think, influencers telling us how to act, bureaucracies deciding our fate with no face and no name. The temptation to stop thinking for ourselves is huge. After all, it's tiring. It demands courage, responsibility. Thinking is uncomfortable. But giving up on thinking is where every ethical collapse begins. Arendt saw this very clearly. For her, thinking isn't something abstract. It's a form of resistance. Thinking is refusing to accept an order just because it's an order. Thinking is keeping the flame of conscience alive, even inside the machine. In her work, Arendt says that moral judgment is only possible when we manage to step out of the current, look from the outside, imagine someone else's point of view, and act not as a piece of a system, but as a unique human being, responsible for their decisions. And that's not something you learn with rules. You don't learn it through indoctrination. You only learn it through the constant practice of reflection. That's why the real fight against everyday stupidity starts inside each one of us. It starts when we choose to pause before obeying. When we ask, why? What for? With what consequences? It starts when we reject empty language, ideological slogans, ready-made narratives. When we have the humility to recognize that thinking takes time, silence, and inner conflict, and that not thinking is a choice, a dangerous one. One of the most symbolic moments in the book is when Arendt describes Eichmann's expression as he's confronted with the human suffering he helped cause. He looks bothered, but not moved. He seems distant, as if none of that had anything to do with him, as if he were just an instrument and not an agent. How many of us today live like that? On autopilot, hitting targets, producing without thinking, reacting without reflecting, obeying without questioning, sharing without reading, judging without knowing. Arendt calls us, with harshness and compassion at the same time, to wake up from this trance. The banality of everyday stupidity is the great moral danger of our time, because it doesn't scream, it doesn't threaten, it doesn't look evil, but it's there, working quietly, like rust that eats away at thought, compassion, and critical awareness. That's why Arendt's lesson is simple and profound. Don't think out of obligation. Think out of responsibility. The world doesn't need more geniuses. It needs more people willing to think before they act. That's where ethics begins. That's where freedom begins. And that's where human dignity begins, in the act of thinking. There's something deeply disturbing about a society where excellence starts being treated as arrogance and mediocrity becomes a symbol of humility. For Friedrich Nietzsche, this is a symptom of a sick civilization. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche presents a prophet who comes down from the mountain to announce an uncomfortable truth. The human being, as we know it, is something that must be overcome. Not out of hatred for humanity, but out of contempt for its stagnation. Modern man shrinks himself to fit the comfort of the crowd. He refuses to grow because growing demands effort, courage, and above all, responsibility. In this scenario, Nietzsche identifies the morality of the herd, a morality based on fear, submission, and the desire to drag everyone down to the same low level. You call will to truth what leads you to this mediocrity, but it is the will to make the world harmless for the weak. Isa. Thus spoke Zarathustra. The herd is not just a metaphor for the majority, it's a way of living morally. The herd can't stand what is different, brilliant, or outstanding. Instead of being inspired by greatness, it treats greatness as a threat. Instead of chasing self-overcoming, it chooses sameness. Nietzsche saw this very clearly. When a society starts to glorify equality at any cost, it stops valuing personal elevation. And when excellence is seen as an attack on normality, resentment is born. Resentment, for Nietzsche, is more than a feeling. It's a defense mechanism of the weak against the strong. Since they cannot be great, they prefer to discredit greatness. Since they cannot rise, they prefer to pull others down. That's how an inverted morality is created, where suffering becomes virtue, passivity becomes nobility, and mediocrity is celebrated as a form of justice. On the genealogy of morality, he traces the origin of this process, the shift from the morality of masters to the morality of slaves. The morality of masters, Nietzsche says, is born from the affirmation of life. It's the yes to strength, creation, and difference. The morality of slaves, on the other hand, is born from denial, envy, and resentment. The slave, unable to act, calls the strong evil and considers himself good for being weak. The good is the noble, the powerful, the elevated. The bad is the vulgar, the low. But the slaves inverted this logic. The good became the humble, the obedient, the one who suffers. This movement is dangerous because it creates a culture where being mediocre is not only acceptable, it's morally superior. The one who stands out is now seen as elitist, arrogant, oppressive. Genius is attacked as a threat. Merit becomes a sin. And gradually, we lose any real sense of excellence. Nietzsche was already seeing this in his own time, but what he didn't live to see, and that might shock him even more, is how this herd logic has been amplified by technology and spread at the speed of social media. We live in an age where shallow opinions are posted with pride, where studying deeply is seen as intellectual snobbery, where thinking differently is a reason to be cancelled, and where ignorance dresses itself up as authenticity. The morality of the herd has, in this new world, the perfect stage to become dominant. And more than that, it presents itself as democratic, as if it were inherently unfair for someone to stand out, for someone to dare to be better. Meritocracy becomes a curse word. Excellence becomes an insult. But Nietzsche didn't want a world of aristocrats in the social or economic sense. He was talking about a spiritual and existential aristocracy. The noble person, for him, is not the rich or the famous, but the one who lives up to their own potential, who refuses to be molded by the mediocrity of the group. Become who you are. Thus spoke Zarathustra. This call is not an invitation to vanity, but to responsibility. Becoming who you are means looking at yourself with brutal honesty. It means giving up the comfort of the herd and accepting the loneliness of the inner journey. And that hurts, because when you start to stand out, the herd reacts. It mocks you, it accuses you. It tries to pull you back down to the acceptable level of collective mediocrity. Nietzsche went through this himself. He was called crazy, isolated, misunderstood, precisely because he refused to adopt the easy values of his time. His philosophy is a cry against conformity, against moral numbness, against the domestication of the human soul. And maybe the clearest symptom of that domestication is pride in being mediocre. Today, how often do we see someone being praised, not for what they've built, but for being just like everybody else? How often do we demand that artists, thinkers, and creators be simple, common, relatable, as if depth were an offense? This cult of mediocrity hides behind words like humility, but deep down it carries resentment disguised as virtue. Because in truth, the herd doesn't want equality. It wants everything leveled down so it doesn't have to feel inferior. Nietzsche believed that the only way out of this was the creation of a new type of human being, the Übermensch, the overman, or beyond man, someone who doesn't bow to inherited moralities, who is not guided by guilt or comparison, but who creates their own values. The overman doesn't hate the herd, but he refuses to live with his soul in chains. He doesn't want to offend the weak, but he also doesn't want to be forced to sink down to mediocrity just to be accepted. That's not arrogance, that's integrity. What is great in man is that he is a bridge and not a goal. Thus spoke Zarathustra. Nietzsche saw life as a crossing, but most people prefer to stay on the riverbank, criticizing those who dare to cross. And when that crossing demands that we abandon the herd's certainties, that's where the real test of inner strength begins. Mediocrity feels threatened by freedom. That's why it tries to impose itself as a norm. It needs everyone to think the same, react the same, feel the same. Anyone who dares to say no becomes suspicious, dangerous, arrogant. But Nietzsche invites us to that no. A sacred no, a creative no, a no that breaks with what's already there, not for vanity, but out of loyalty to life in its most intense form. And that call demands courage, because living authentically in the middle of the herd means being a constant target of misunderstanding. But it's also the only way to keep humanity's creative spark alive. There is nothing virtuous about hiding behind mediocrity. There is no goodness in suffocating your own talent just to please others. There is no humility in denying the light of those who shine. That's not morality. That's resentment turned into ideology. Nietzsche doesn't ask us to be superior to others. He asks us to be superior to ourselves, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And that is the true Nietzschean ethic, to overcome yourself, not out of hatred for what you were, but out of love for what you can still become. We live in a world where reality has been hijacked by images. For Guy Debord, a French thinker and founder of the Situationist International, modern society is no longer organized around the production of goods like the industrial societies of the 19th century. Now everything revolves around the production of images, representations, and appearances. That's what he calls the society of the spectacle. The spectacle is not a collection of images, but a social relation among people, mediated by images. That means we're not just watching the spectacle, we're living inside it. Social life, politics, and even emotions turn into a constant performance. What matters is no longer what something is, but how it looks. Appearance beats essence. Surface swallows depth. In the logic of the spectacle, everything becomes an image to be consumed. Politics turns into marketing. Friendship becomes a follow account. Experience becomes a selfie. Knowledge is reduced to a 30-second clip made to go viral online. Everything has to be quick, easy to digest, and packaged as entertainment, even if it's empty. That's where the process of collective dumbing down begins. Because thinking is hard work. Reflecting takes time. And the spectacle doesn't want critical viewers. It wants satisfied, distracted consumers. Debord is not just talking about television, as some people think. He's talking about a whole way of life based on aesthetic alienation, being cut off from reality by images. The society of the spectacle is one where the real is constantly replaced by simulations, where what matters is not living something, but showing that you lived it. You're at a beautiful sunset. First, take the picture, post it, wait for likes, feel validated. Only then, maybe, look at the sky. Maybe the image came before the experience, and maybe it replaced it. That's the core of Debord's critique. Human experience has been hijacked by the consumption of representations, and that turns people into passive spectators of their own lives. In the spectacle, we are trained to watch, to consume, to react, but not to create and not to think. And the more society is flooded with images, the more we lose touch with concrete reality. Debord says the spectacle is capital accumulated to the point where it becomes image. In other words, The economic system itself now expresses itself through seductive images, shiny ads, and prepackaged lifestyles. But what's the danger in that? The danger is that everything turns into distraction, and distraction is the most effective weapon of modern domination. The spectacle is the main tool of social control. You don't need to censor people, just entertain them. You don't need to repress them, just distract them. People stop caring about politics, ethics, or truth. As long as their feed is full, the next show is out, and life feels fun. This is the comfortable stupidity of the society of the spectacle. A stupidity that isn't aggressive, it's satisfied. A happy ignorance, constantly fed with memes, sounds, images, and ready-made stories. And the more we're fed this kind of content, the more our critical capacity weakens. Time for deep thought disappears. Patience for real argument dies. Everything has to be simple, direct, fast. Everything has to fit into a TikTok, a reel, a tweet. Speed becomes the new value. Reflection starts to look like a waste of time. But this dumbing down isn't just cultural. It's structural. The logic of the spectacle creates a system where visual and emotional stimuli are constant. There's no room for silence, boredom, or doubt. And without those spaces, thought never really matures. Debord saw this as a new form of domination. Domination through permanent distraction. And it works so well that most people don't even notice. Everything looks normal. Everything is fun. Everything is light. But little by little, we lose our sense of depth, weight, and reality. Politics becomes entertainment. Serious debates turn into team sports. Leaders are chosen for how they look and speak, not for the ethics behind their thinking. Complex ideas are mocked as boring, and what wins is the meme, the catchphrase, the one-liner. What was once directly lived has become mere representation, and that has deep consequences. When life turns into a spectacle, the person is no longer the main character of their own existence. They become an audience member, a follower. They react to content, but don't create meaning. They consume ideas, but don't build real convictions. And the more someone lives for the image, the more afraid they become of stepping away from it. That's where the panic of not being seen comes from. Not showing up, not performing, not getting engagement. And with that, the self starts to empty out. The self becomes a profile, a look, a personal brand. And life turns into a stage where everyone is acting, but almost nobody is really living. Debord saw this coming with scary precision, and his critique is an urgent warning. The more we surrender to the spectacle, the less room there is for real thought, real encounters, real experience. But the problem isn't technology itself. It's how technology is used to keep this logic of constant distraction running. There's nothing wrong with laughing, having fun, or using social media. The problem is living only for that. Not being able to handle anything that isn't instant and superficial. The stupidity created by the society of the spectacle is soft, quiet, smiling. But it's devastating, because it doesn't destroy with violence. It dissolves with passivity. And that passivity is not neutral. It serves a system that needs people not to think, not to question, not to resist. A system that needs people to accept easy stories, that blurs the line between looking good and being good. Deep down, Debord is telling us that the biggest tragedy of our time is not being fooled by brutal tyrants. It's being seduced by a world that offers us fun instead of meaning. That gives us stimulation instead of experience. That turns us into spectators of ourselves. Getting dumber through entertainment is more effective than any censorship, because it doesn't shut us up by force, it just keeps us busy all the time. Nobody needs to stop us from thinking. We just need to be constantly distracted from thinking. And that distraction is addictive, because it feels good. It gives comfort, dopamine, validation. And so, we become contented fools, not because we're incapable, but because we choose it. Out of fear of emptiness, fear of silence, fear of facing real life without filters, without likes, without a soundtrack. Debord invites us to break this pattern, to recover the value of presence, of direct experience, of slow thought, to step out of the role of spectator and reclaim the role of author of our own existence. The danger in a society doesn't always come from tyrants. Sometimes, collapse begins when nobody is willing to admit they don't know what they're talking about. In The Revolt of the Masses, Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset presents one of the harshest and most prophetic diagnoses of modernity: the rise of the mass man. A type of human who, according to him, is not defined by social class, education level, or profession, but by an attitude toward life. The mass man is the one who, even without preparation, without study, without deep reflection, feels entitled to have an opinion on everything, to rule over everything, to decide everything, and to be proud of it. The mass man does not want to give reasons or submit to reasons. He wants to impose his opinions. This person, Ortega says, is the product of a society that democratized access to information, but did not cultivate critical thinking. He confuses having an opinion with having authority. He believes the world should bend to what he feels, not to what is rationally built. And more than that, the mass man despises the specialist, the wise person, the intellectual, the true artist, not because he disagrees with them using arguments, but because he can't stand anything that surpasses him. The figure of the mass man has nothing to do with humble people or ordinary workers. Quite the opposite. For Ortega, the problem is not the simple citizen. It's the person who, even being ignorant, believes they are on the same level as those who have studied, researched, created, and dedicated decades to a subject. This is not elitism, but a denunciation of how knowledge and authority have been vulgarized. Modern society, with its technological advances and democratic promises, ended up creating space not only for the masses to participate in culture, which would be a good thing, but for the masses to take control of culture, imposing average taste, shallow thinking, and uninformed opinion as the norm. The mass has invaded everything, and everything has become accessible, even what requires preparation, sensitivity, and competence. The result is the tyranny of mediocrity, a world where the loudest voice matters more than the most informed one, where the expert has to apologize for being too technical, where complexity is seen as arrogance and doubt as weakness. The mass man feels powerful because he is within his rights to have an opinion, but he refuses any responsibility for what he says. He wants to talk about science without knowing the scientific method. He wants to discuss art without knowing art history. He wants to opine on public policy based on memes, and he does all that with unshakable certainty, as if simply feeling something were enough to make it true. The mass man doesn't argue, he reacts. But where does this attitude come from? Ortega y Gasset suggests that, with the growth of material comfort, technology, and the ease with which the modern world started fulfilling people's wishes, a type of human being emerged who never had to surpass themselves. They never went through the discipline of effort or the humility of learning. They live in immediacy. They got used to consuming without reflecting. And so, they became infantilized, but with power. That's the most dangerous point. The mass man doesn't know, but he rules. He votes. He influences. He shares. He cancels. He elects. He dictates what can or cannot be said. And he does this with conviction because he believes that having a voice is the same as being right. But a society where everyone talks and nobody listens, where everyone gives opinions and nobody studies, where everyone wants to influence but nobody wants to be transformed, is a society walking toward paralysis or chaos. Ortega warns, it's not about silencing the masses, it's about reminding everyone that no one is above the need for education, humility, and self-criticism. This revolt of the masses shows up in every area: culture, politics, science, and education. Today, how often do we see people dismissing experts simply because they don't like what they hear? How often do we see a baseless opinion placed side by side with solid knowledge, as if they were equivalent? The problem isn't disagreement. The problem is contempt for knowledge. It's the refusal to make the effort to understand, to listen, to be challenged. The mass man considers himself perfect, and because of that, he closes himself off to any effort of self-improvement. The consequence is the normalization of ignorance. Pride in talking wrong and not caring, contempt for reading, sarcasm toward anyone who thinks deeply. Mediocrity starts being celebrated as a sign of being real, while excellence becomes something to mock. In this scenario, the true thinker starts being treated as annoying. The sensitive artist is called weird. The teacher who demands reading is elitist, and the politician who doesn't scream is weak. Oh, so society starts flipping its criteria. Noise matters more than content. Charm matters more than character. Going viral matters more than truth. And the more this spreads, the weaker the culture of merit, reflection, and intellectual responsibility becomes. Because the mass man doesn't want to learn. He wants to impose his view. He doesn't want to grow. He wants to win. And for him, winning means silencing others. Ortega y Gasset saw this process as a threat to civilization itself, because a civilization only moves forward when it recognizes differences in competence. When culture understands that certain areas require training, time, listening, and study. When that recognition disappears, when everyone thinks they're an expert in everything, when every form of authority is mocked, when ignorance is celebrated, what's left is a deafening noise. A flood of voices cancelling each other out, with no direction, no criteria, no depth. But there's something even more dangerous. The mass man not only doesn't know he's ignorant, he's proud of it. And here we find the root of modern stupidity. It's no longer a cognitive limitation, but an existential choice, a deliberate refusal of complexity. The mass man wants a simple world, split into good and evil, right and wrong, my side, and their side. He can't stand nuance, ambiguity, or long reflection. He needs slogans, short phrases, absolute certainty, and the more shallow the speech, the easier it is to swallow. That's why he clings to simplistic ideologies, populist leaders, and magical solutions. Because anything that demands thinking challenges him, and anything that challenges him, he attacks. Barbarism consists precisely in the refusal to listen. And the most ironic part, the mass man is not an outcast. He's the majority. He's everywhere. And the more validated he feels, the more he despises any kind of authority that doesn't automatically agree with him. The revolt of the masses, in this sense, is not an uprising against oppressors. It's an uprising against thought itself. And that's a kind of revolution that doesn't liberate. It just destroys the foundations of civilized coexistence. Ortega y Gasset didn't write this to make us scared, but to call us to responsibility. The answer to the mass man is not elitist disdain. It's demanding more from ourselves. It's bringing back the value of knowledge, of listening, of intellectual humility. Because the only way to defeat the revolt of ignorance is with a revolution of consciousness. Stupidity doesn't always show up as ignorance. Sometimes it hides behind a mask of efficiency. Max Weber, one of the founders of modern sociology, saw this very clearly. In his analysis of modern bureaucracy, he gives us a disturbing picture. A system where moral judgment is replaced by protocols, where responsibility disappears inside papers and forms, and where everyone says they were just following orders. Weber described bureaucracy as a form of social organization marked by instrumental rationality, that is, the pursuit of maximum efficiency through fixed rules, clear hierarchies, and impersonality. At first, that sounds positive. Less arbitrariness, more predictability, more control. But there's a hidden cost in this logic. That cost, for Weber, is the iron cage of rationality, an invisible prison, built not with bars, but with reports, stamps, meetings, and org charts. A system so perfectly rational that it ends up eliminating the human ability to decide based on ethics, empathy, or common sense. Bureaucracy develops the type of specialization that makes the official effective, but also makes the system inhuman. Inside this cage, no one is really responsible for anything. Each person does their job, passes the file along, follows procedures, and if something goes wrong, it's never anyone's fault in particular. It's the system's fault. That's the essence of bureaucratic stupidity. It's not an individual lack of intelligence, but a moral collapse created by structural obedience. Everyone does their part correctly, but the whole can lead to absurdity, suffering, or even horror, and no one feels guilty about it. Weber saw bureaucracy as the peak of modernity, but also as its hidden danger. A system where technical logic replaces ethical spirit, where knowing how to do something is more important than knowing why you're doing it, and where the question, "Is this right?" gets replaced by, "Is this in the protocol?" And this isn't just theoretical. It shows up every day. Picture a public hospital worker who refuses to treat someone in pain because the form isn't filled out correctly. Picture an inspector who gives out a ridiculous fine because that's what the regulation says. Picture a police officer who follows an unjust order because it's not my job to question. In all these cases, there's no intentional evil. There's something more subtle, the suspension of individual responsibility in the name of keeping the machine running. That's why bureaucracy becomes one of the most dangerous forms of stupidity in the modern world, because it looks neutral, objective, technical, but it can produce monstrous injustices with an air of normality. Max Weber noticed that the more complex the modern world becomes, the more we depend on rational organization of large structures, governments, companies, schools, hospitals, justice systems. But the bigger these structures get, the more automated, specialized, and impersonal they become. And within them, the individual turns into the employee. Their job is not to think or judge, it's to execute. The ideal bureaucratic official is one who performs his duties with precision, without personal interference. The logic of "I just follow orders" becomes normal, and with that, ethics disappears from practical decisions. The standard of what's just is replaced by the standard of what's compliant. And here we return to the central point, the iron cage. Weber used this metaphor to warn that as technical rationality advances, human beings risk losing their most essential freedom, the freedom to judge, to choose, and to assume moral responsibility. The cage is made of rules, procedures, targets, statistics, and that's why it's almost invisible. No one feels imprisoned, but no one truly decides anything with real autonomy. This kind of organization creates a particular kind of alienation. People become cogs in a system that runs without a soul. Efficiency is maximized. Thinking is minimized. And the most ironic part, the system can be working perfectly while producing human suffering. That's the point where bureaucracy gets dangerously close to evil. Hannah Arendt, when analyzing the Eichmann case, as we saw earlier, saw in him exactly this ideal bureaucratic type: efficient, obedient, technical, and he helped organize the extermination of millions of people. The scariest thing is that Eichmann didn't look like a monster. He looked like a manager, a standard employee, a logistics specialist. It's in this kind of structure that bureaucratic stupidity reveals itself, not as intentional moral evil, but as the abandonment of individual moral judgment. It's obedience without reflection. Orders carried out without conscience. And today, this happens at many levels. In companies that chase impossible targets, even if it destroys employees' mental health. In schools that teach only for the test, not for thinking. In governments that decide people's lives through spreadsheets. In systems that treat people like numbers. All of this under the logic of technical rationality. But Weber knew this kind of rationality is incomplete. It's effective for organizing means, but it cannot decide ends. And without reflection on ends, society becomes functional but empty, rich in results, poor in values. The iron cage is, therefore, the portrait of a civilization that has lost its capacity for moral thinking, where everything is measured, but nothing is judged. where everything is calculated, but nothing is questioned. And when individuals get used to living inside this logic, they abandon their own conscience. They learn to obey, to comply, to do their part, but forget that their part affects the whole. That's the root of bureaucratic stupidity. It doesn't come from malice. It comes from moral omission disguised as technical competence. And the worst part, it's rewarded. The good employee is the one who doesn't question. The good manager is the one who doesn't get emotional. The good professional is the one who doesn't mix feelings with work. But what does that say about our world? Modernity, by putting instrumental rationality as the highest value, created a trap. It made us efficient, but not ethical. It taught us how to optimize, but not how to reflect. It gave us manuals, but took away our moral compass. And that's a problem that can't be solved with more rules. It can only be faced with more awareness. Weber didn't propose ending bureaucracy. He knew it was necessary for the modern world. But he left us a warning. If we don't bring moral thinking back into rational structures, we will become prisoners of an order without a soul. And in this scenario, stupidity won't come from the ignorant. It will come from the obedient. Many people believe the greatest enemy of freedom is tyranny. But for Immanuel Kant, the real danger doesn't come from the outside. It comes from within. From an intimate, silent decision. The choice not to think for yourself. In 1784, in his famous essay, What is Enlightenment?, Kant wrote one of the most powerful lines in modern philosophy. Enlightenment is man's exit from his self-imposed immaturity. What he calls immaturity is not about age, but about the inability to use your own understanding without the guidance of someone else. In other words, it's the refusal to think for yourself. And even worse, it's the choice to stay dependent, even when you already have the conditions to stand on your own feet. For Kant, ignorance is not what really imprisons us. It's the laziness to think. It's more comfortable to follow orders, to believe in whatever comes ready-made, to hand over decisions to authorities, governments, experts, or today, influencers. This choice to stay childish, to live in a state of immaturity, is the perfect soil for modern stupidity. I have a book that thinks for me, a pastor who has a conscience for me, a doctor who judges for me, so I don't need to make any effort. That's the picture of the person who gives up the responsibility of judging the world, who outsources their conscience, who hands over the steering wheel of their own reason to someone else, and thinks that's normal. Kant was clear. Most people prefer to stay in immaturity, not because they lack ability, but because they're too comfortable. Thinking is tiring. It demands courage. It demands autonomy. It demands facing the discomfort of not having ready-made answers, so it's easier to just obey. In Kant's time, this applied to religion, monarchy, and dogmatic science. But today, the same logic repeats itself with different names. How many people stop thinking for themselves because they blindly follow whatever they saw in a video? How many share opinions without questioning anything? How many defend ideas just because they were said by someone famous? How many confuse authority with truth? Immaturity in the 21st century has new outfits, but it's still the same thing. The self-imposed inability to think for yourself. And here's the most disturbing part of Kant's text. He says this mental submission is a choice. Human beings are born with reason. We have the power to judge, to analyze, to question. But we voluntarily give that up. We prefer other people to think for us. And the more we get used to this dependence, the harder it becomes to get our freedom back. The result? A society of childish adults. People with age and responsibilities, but without intellectual autonomy. People who follow trends, repeat slogans, echo opinions, but have no idea where their own beliefs come from. This is comfortable stupidity, the kind that doesn't bother anyone because it's socially accepted. The kind that looks normal because everyone is in the same state of collective immaturity. Kant identifies two factors that keep people in this condition: laziness and cowardice. Laziness blocks intellectual effort. It's easier to go with the flow. Cowardice blocks facing the unknown. Thinking for yourself takes courage. The courage to disagree, to question truths that everyone repeats, to admit you were wrong. That's why Kant says enlightenment is a slow process, painful, but necessary. It's like walking out of a dark room. At first, the light hurts your eyes. But then, your vision opens up, and with it, your freedom. The motto of enlightenment is sapere aude, dare to know. This cry, dare to know, is a call to intellectual rebellion, not a shallow rebellion that rejects everything on impulse, but a mature rebellion that demands reason, discernment, study, and reflection. Real enlightenment, according to Kant, is not believing in everything. It's learning how to doubt with good reasons. It's not accepting an idea just because it's popular. It's wanting to understand, not just to react. And here a modern tension appears. People want freedom, but they don't want to think. They want autonomy, but not responsibility. They want to give opinions, but don't want to study. Kant exposes this paradox perfectly. He shows us there is no freedom without enlightenment, and there is no enlightenment without effort. Today, we see this self-imposed immaturity spreading through the shallow use of information. Social media gave everyone a voice, which is a good thing. But at the same time, it created a flood of opinions with no foundation. The problem is not having an opinion. The problem is not wanting to go deeper, not wanting to listen, not wanting to learn. How many people feel free just because they can shout what they think, but are actually slaves to other people's thinking, to algorithms, to ready-made speeches? Kant suggested a different path. He believed autonomy starts in the mind, that no one is truly free while they still depend on someone else to think for them. That's why enlightenment is not a gift. It's an achievement, a practice, a daily habit of questioning, revising, researching, doubting, reflecting. Of course, many times we need to trust experts, but Kant makes a crucial distinction. It's not wrong to listen to someone. The mistake is to follow someone without thinking. Legitimate authority for Kant is the one that doesn't demand blind obedience, but encourages the use of reason. The good teacher doesn't just command, they awaken. The good leader doesn't impose, they persuade. A good argument doesn't silence, it invites you to think. But modern immaturity prefers shortcuts. It prefers catchphrases, short videos, charismatic gurus, easy promises. And little by little, people settle for a kind of aesthetic freedom that looks like freedom, but is just an illusion. True freedom, Kant says, is inner freedom, the freedom that lets you think without someone else holding your hand, to choose with awareness, to act with responsibility, and that can't be bought. It has to be built. Live in such a way that you could will your action to become a universal law. This ethical rule, the categorical imperative, comes from the same source, the autonomous use of reason. Enlightenment is not just an idea, it's a moral practice. Someone who thinks for themselves doesn't just live better, they live in a more ethical, fair, and truly human way. But the laziness to think is still the great ally of modern stupidity, because it's easier to laugh than to investigate, more comfortable to repeat than to create, easier to follow than to take a stand. And so we form crowds of individuals who believe they are free, but live guided by external voices. Kant, more than 200 years ago, already saw this coming. That's why his text is still current, necessary, urgent. He challenges us. Are you really thinking for yourself? Or are you just repeating what you were told to think? Enlightenment, for Kant, is the birth of the mature subject, the human being who no longer needs ideological crutches or intellectual babysitters, the individual who accepts the freedom and the pain of thinking with their own head, because thinking, in the end, is the greatest act of courage a person can practice. Not all alienation comes from censorship. A lot of it comes from entertainment. In their classic dialectic of enlightenment, Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, two major thinkers of the Frankfurt School, launched a fierce critique of what they called the culture industry. For them, modern culture, movies, music, television, and today social media, has been turned into a machine of ideological control, capable of producing empty heads that look free. Culture has been transformed into an industry. Spirit has been transformed into a commodity. What's at stake here is not simply the fact that we consume art or fun, but the way culture has been tamed so it stops being critical and becomes just distraction. Entertainment, they say, is not neutral. It shapes how we feel, think, and react. And in the logic of the culture industry, thinking is dangerous. Distraction is profitable. They argue that mass culture is not meant to uplift the human spirit, but to keep it busy, numbed and tame. Popular music is standardized. Movies follow the same formulas. TV series come with generic characters, predictable plots, and emotionally manipulative messages. Everything is built to be consumed with no effort, like mental fast food. But what's so dangerous about that? Adorno and Horkheimer show that this repetition is not innocent. It trains the audience to never find anything strange, to never question anything, to accept everything as normal. Over time, people lose their critical sensitivity. Their aesthetic sense gets flattened. Their ability to feel outrage disappears. Culture, which should wake us up, starts putting us to sleep. The spectator is not supposed to work with his own head. The product prescribes every reaction. This creates a very effective form of modern stupidity, intellectual passivity. People are surrounded by sounds, images, stories, but nothing that actually invites them to think. Everything is designed to entertain, never to unsettle. And this is a key difference between culture as art and culture as industry. Real art disturbs, provokes, demands something from the viewer. It asks for time, attention, openness. The culture industry, on the other hand, offers only what is already familiar. It repeats what the audience already expects, reinforces cliches, delivers pre-packaged emotions. Everything is quick, easy, and leveled down. According to them, this creates a cycle of emotional and mental training. People are taught to feel without thinking, to react without understanding, to obey without noticing. This obedience is subtle. There is no direct order, but there is deep conditioning. The culture industry teaches, for example, that success is measured by fame and money, that love is always romantic and idealized, that the villain is always someone out there, that the system is inevitable, that rebels are silly or dangerous. None of this needs to be said explicitly. It's built into the stories, the images, the plots, like an invisible kind of schooling. And the most worrying part, people enjoy it. They feel comfortable. They don't realize they are being shaped. Adorno and Horkheimer call this the regression of listening and perception. Someone who is used to consuming content that demands no effort loses the ability to focus on more complex works. A Beethoven quartet, a Dostoevsky novel, a Goya painting. All of that becomes boring because it demands attention, it demands silence, it demands thought. In a society ruled by the culture industry, everything has to be instant, light, pleasant. Art that doesn't fit this mold is pushed to the margins, and with that, human imagination itself is gradually domesticated. Amusement is the prolongation of work under late capitalism. This line sums up one of their most powerful critiques. Entertainment doesn't free us. It extends the logic of submission. After a whole day of alienating work, a person comes home looking for rest. But that rest is supplied by cultural products designed to keep the same pattern of passivity going. They don't become free, they just change the shape of their chains. And here lies the paradox. Mass culture presents itself as freedom, but it's a disguised form of control. You are free to choose among hundreds of movies that all tell the same kind of story. You're free to listen to millions of songs that all follow the same catchy chorus structure. You're free to follow thousands of accounts that copy the same behavior patterns. This freedom is an illusion. The range of choices is huge, but the content is narrow. And with massive repetition, little by little, it creates minds that consume a lot, but think very little. It's important to note that Adorno and Horkheimer weren't attacking popular culture out of elitism. What they attacked was standardization, the industrialization of culture, its transformation into a market product. Because that kills the noblest role of art, to reveal the world from new angles. For them, art should be what breaks the everyday routine, not what mirrors it, what destabilizes what seemed fixed, what reveals what was hidden, what challenges our gaze, not just soothes it. But in the logic of the culture industry, everything is produced to confirm what we already know, reinforce what we already feel, affirm what we already believe. Culture stops being creation and becomes repetition. And what does that have to do with stupidity? Everything. Because stupidity here is not a lack of intelligence, it's a lack of real contact with reality. It's living in a simulated world full of empty stimuli where everything seems busy, but nothing truly changes. It's an inactive intelligence, a mind overloaded with content, but emptied of depth. And the worst part, this dumbing down is self-inflicted. People seek out this kind of content because they were trained to want it, because they don't know anything else anymore, because the culture industry creates the taste and then feeds it. The audience asks for what it was taught to like, and the system delivers. A closed cycle that eliminates the new, the strange, the critical. Consumers behave as if they were choosing, but in fact they are being chosen. Today, this diagnosis is even more urgent. With social media, the spectacle of the culture industry has become interactive. Now we don't just watch, we perform. We produce our own content, but we follow the same logic of performance, visibility, likes, and ready-made aesthetics. We are producers and products at the same time, and thinking, more and more, is reduced to reactions. That's why Adorno and Horkheimer's critique is still alive. It challenges us to recover the ability to think against the flow, to seek cultural experiences that challenge instead of just please, that question instead of simply confirm. And this is not an elitist task, it's an existential one. It's about recovering art as a space of freedom, not conformity. Because where art dies, thought also dies. And where thought dies, stupidity spreads, elegant, fun, satisfied. We live in a time when no one forces us to work, and yet we work ourselves to exhaustion. No one watches us with open violence, and yet we police ourselves all the time. No one openly oppresses us, and yet we feel crushed by anxiety, guilt, and the constant sense of never being enough. This is the reality that South Korean philosopher Byung-Chul Han calls the Burnout society, an era in which a person is no longer exploited by someone else, they exploit themselves. It's no longer the boss pushing you, it's you with your goals, your projects, your inner musts. And this new kind of human being, shaped by productivity and performance, Han calls the performance subject, or, in a more radical sense, the productive idiot. Today, everyone carries their own work camp in their pocket, and they whip themselves with the idea that they could be doing more. This productive idiot is not stupid. On the contrary, they are efficient, disciplined, connected, optimized. They have 1,000 tasks a day. They read summaries, listen to sped-up podcasts, answer emails at 2 a.m., work out while listening to an audiobook about productivity. But they don't think. They don't contemplate. They don't rebel. They just execute. Han shows that 21st century capitalism doesn't want a disciplined worker anymore. It wants a human being who is an entrepreneur of themselves, someone who sees life as a project, manages themselves like a company, lives in constant self-improvement, someone who never stops. And that sounds liberating. After all, there's no visible external imposition. You're free. You choose. You're the owner of your time. But that freedom is a trap. Because in practice, there's no longer any boundary between work and life. Productivity seeps into everything: food, leisure, relationships, sleep. Everything has to produce results. Everything has to be measured, optimized, used well. Even free time becomes an obligation. You have to meditate, but with the goal of being more efficient. You have to sleep well, so you can perform better. You have to go to therapy to produce in a more balanced way. The contemporary subject is both his own executioner and his own victim. This is the logic that creates the productive idiot, the person who no longer needs a boss because they carry the boss inside. And because of that, they never rest. They never switch off. They never really breathe. They're always chasing something, but no longer know exactly what. This person is tired. But it's not physical tiredness. It's tiredness of the soul, emotional, moral, existential exhaustion. A tiredness that comes from the constant pressure to be more, to always improve, to never waste time. And the most tragic part, they think this is freedom. They believe they're in control. They see themselves as warriors, achievers. Our current culture reinforces this all the time. Be your best version. You can do anything. Don't stop until you're proud. The result is a hyperactive and at the same time empty society. People always busy, but with no idea why. People who fill their days with tasks, but have no inner space left. People who talk about everything, but say nothing. Byung-Chul Han calls this a crisis of negativity in the name of total positivity, constant productivity, endless motivation, permanent self-help. We eliminated pause, silence, absence, waiting, and the word no. And in that process, we lost the ability to think. Thinking requires stopping. Thinking requires not knowing. Thinking requires being able to sit with emptiness. But the productive idiot can't stand emptiness. If they stop, they panic. They feel like they're failing, like they're useless, like they're falling behind. So they stay busy. All the time. Fill the calendar, the feed, the mind. There is always another video to watch, another piece of content to consume, another metric to hit. And what's left after all that? Nothing. Just fatigue, anxiety, and a growing void. The productive idiot is everywhere. They're the influencer who turns every moment into content. The professional who can't disconnect from email. The student doing 4 online courses at once, but not really absorbing any of them. And the most disturbing part, they're proud of it. They post about waking up at 5 a.m., about reading a book a week, about always working on themselves. But this evolution is a race with no finish line. The system will never allow them to feel complete. The market needs them to feel permanently lacking, always behind, always needing more. That's why Han says the burnout society is also a society of self-exploitation. No one needs to force us anymore, because we've learned to exploit ourselves enthusiastically. And with that, we become perfect for the system. There's no more conflict, no more resistance, no strikes, no real protest, because everyone is too busy trying to win individually, each person for themselves, and in that process, the collective disappears. Politics becomes noise, art becomes algorithm, spirituality becomes a service, everything turns into a product. Everything gets sucked into the logic of efficiency, and the stupidity that comes out of this is not loud, it's silent. It's the stupidity of someone who no longer sees the world outside the performance mindset, who can't look at a landscape without turning it into a post, who can't listen to someone without already thinking of what to say next. Han points out that in this scenario, critical thinking doesn't disappear because of repression. It disappears because of exhaustion. We're so overloaded, fragmented, and accelerated that we simply don't have the energy left to question anything. It's a modern kind of alienation, not through lack of information, but through excess, not through censorship, but through fatigue. The productive idiot is not dumb, they're just too exhausted to resist. And the system knows that. It knows that a tired mind doesn't argue, that an anxious body doesn't stop to reflect, that an exhausted soul doesn't ask why. That's why Byung-Chul Han defends the recovery of contemplation, of boredom, of silence, of pause. He calls for a slow revolution, a return to deep listening, a reconnection with not doing, not producing, because clarity is born in silence, creation is born in the gap, freedom is born in the refusal to produce. But today, all of that sounds almost scandalous. How can you stop? How can you rest? How can you do nothing? The performance society turns freedom into self-exploitation, and the result is self-annihilation. This is the fate of the productive idiot, to be destroyed by the very system that applauds them, to be the perfect cog in the machine until they break. And when they break, they're discarded, replaced, and the cycle starts again. That's why the greatest act of resistance today is not shouting, it's stopping, it's not speeding up. It's saying no. No to excess. No to constant performance. No to the logic that turns every human being into a personal brand. Clarity in this era is revolutionary. Pause in this system is an act of rebellion. And maybe, just maybe, the beginning of healing for this sick world is having the courage to be unproductive. There is something more dangerous than a deliberate lie. A systematic lie. Repeated, accepted, and even celebrated. A lie that stops being just falsehood and becomes structure, environment, the very air a society breathes. For Hannah Arendt, this manipulation of truth, when organized and institutionalized, produces a kind of active, collective, functional, and devastating ignorance. That's what she talks about in her essay, Truth and Politics, published in 1967. But what Arendt wrote back then sounds almost prophetic today in a world marked by fake news, polarization, and the collapse of public discernment. Freedom of opinion is a farce unless factual information is guaranteed. Here's the first shock she gives us. There is no real freedom when truth is collapsing. Because without facts, without a shared reality, debate turns into yelling. Politics becomes a war of narratives. And opinion stops being legitimate disagreement and turns into an ideological weapon. Arendt distinguishes two types of truth. Rational truth, the kind you argue about, like moral or political ideas. Factual truth, the kind that simply is and is not up for negotiation. Saying 2 plus 2 = 4 is a rational truth, but saying that someone was murdered, that a war happened, that a vaccine saves lives, these are factual truths. They are the ground of reality, the starting point for any meaningful conversation. And it's exactly this ground that modern politics is destroying. Factual truths are extremely fragile. Once they are called into question, they are not likely to survive the onslaught. Lies have always existed. Arendt knows that. What changes in modern times is the scale, speed, and structure of the lie. Today, it's no longer just an isolated error. It's strategy, method, system. It appears in official speeches, spreads through propaganda machines, gets boosted by algorithms, recycled by influencers, and eventually normalized by sheer exhaustion. Yes, too much lying wears truth down until it starts to feel irrelevant. People no longer know who to trust, what to believe, what is fact, and what is opinion. Everything becomes a narrative. Everything is a version. Everything is a point of view. The result is the trivialization of lying. Arendt warns that this doesn't just create passive ignorance, it creates organized ignorance, an ignorance that works, that serves power, that moves crowds, that builds a parallel reality, an ignorance fueled not by lack of information, but by an excess of disordered and manipulated information. Where everybody lies about everything all of the time, the result is not that you believe the lies, but that nobody believes anything any longer. And when nobody believes anything, everything becomes possible. This is where lying stops being just a moral problem and becomes a political tool. Because when truth dissolves, the tyrant's opinion is worth as much as the scientist's. The shout of the ignorant weighs as much as the analysis of a scholar. Rumor beats data, and in the end, whoever controls the lie controls reality. Arendt saw this clearly in the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. Both Nazism and Stalinism rebuilt history on top of fabricated lies, spread with almost scientific precision. They erased facts, rewrote events, created myths. And by doing that, they created people who could no longer think outside their ideological bubble. Today, the same phenomenon repeats itself, in different forms, but with the same essence. The difference is that the lie has been democratized. It no longer needs a ministry of propaganda. It spreads through the hands of ordinary citizens who share without checking, comment without understanding, and repeat without thinking. And here, a new kind of modern fool is born, the confident ignoramus. The person who doesn't know, but is absolutely sure, who rejects experts, distrusts science, mocks knowledge, and thinks they are being critical, when in reality, they are just being manipulated. This new ignorance is a powerful weapon because it doesn't require brute force. All it takes is repeating a lie 1,000 times, creating doubt, turning what is false into a controversy and what is true into ideology. Then chaos takes over. In a climate of informational chaos, the winner is not the one who is right, it's the one who shouts the loudest. That's what accelerates collective stupidity, the collapse of common sense, the disappearance of a shared reality, and with that, the end of politics as a space for dialogue. Because without truth, there is no debate, only manipulation. And the most tragic part, all this can happen without anyone really noticing. Because organized ignorance doesn't present itself as ignorance. It presents itself as legitimate opinion, as freedom of speech, as resistance to the system. But Arendt warns us, freedom requires truth. Freedom without commitment to facts is just noise. Democracy without respect for reality is theatre. The disregard of truth, if it becomes universal, is a sure sign of the advent of tyranny. That tyranny today may not come with tanks in the streets. It comes with memes, slogans, bots, viral videos. It comes with the saturation of language, the destruction of trust, and absolute relativism. And all of that seems harmless, until it's too late. Arendt calls us to resist, but this resistance is not built on loud outrage. It's built on a quiet commitment to facts, on the rigorous search for truth, on refusing simplification, on cultivating clarity. In a time when everyone wants to be right, the most revolutionary act may simply be to tell the truth, calmly, consistently, and courageously. But that courage requires preparation. It requires thinking. It requires criticism. It requires rejecting superficiality. Because where truth becomes irrelevant, lying becomes the rule. And when lying becomes the rule, what settles in is barbarism, just dressed up as normal life. Organized ignorance doesn't destroy with brute force. It corrodes with noise. It turns citizens into repeaters, into blind defenders of ideas they never really understood, into soldiers of narratives that use them and then throw them away. Arendt believed that thinking was the only real defense against this kind of alienation. Not thinking in the academic sense, but in the ethical sense. Thinking as an act of responsibility, as an exercise of judgment, as an antidote to the collapse of reality. Because in the end, truth doesn't scream, it endures. And to make it endure, today, is an act of intellectual courage. We've never been this connected, and paradoxically, never this controlled. On the surface, the digital age looks like the triumph of freedom, real-time information, open social networks, countless voices. But beneath this supposedly liberating surface, a sophisticated system of surveillance, control, and production of subjectivity is at work. A system Michel Foucault would immediately recognize as a new kind of power, more subtle, more efficient, and more dangerous. Power is productive. It produces knowledge, discourse, truth, and subjects. This line is the key to understanding what's at stake. Power doesn't just repress, it shapes. It doesn't simply silence, it formats what can be said. And in the digital world, This power shows up through platforms, algorithms, and mechanisms that regulate what we see, what we hear, and even what we come to believe. In Discipline and Punish, Foucault analyzes the figure of the panopticon, an ideal prison in which inmates are constantly visible to a central tower, without ever knowing if they're actually being watched at that exact moment. The genius of this model is that, even without direct surveillance, prisoners start behaving as if they were being watched all the time. According to Foucault, this mechanism goes far beyond prisons. It structures modern society itself, and today, it's built into all our devices: phones, networks, cameras, notifications, GPS. The difference now is that we choose to be watched. We voluntarily post where we are, what we think, who we're with, what we buy. We hand over our data, preferences, emotions, and in return, we get convenience. But that convenience has an invisible cost. It traps us in personalized bubbles, tailored to confirm what we already believe. This is the new form of panopticism. Not coercive surveillance, but surveillance by seduction. We live in a time when control has become internal and domination voluntary. We're led to believe that we choose everything: what to watch, who to follow, what to consume. But in reality, we only see what the algorithm serves us, and it chooses based on a single criterion, reinforcing our existing worldview. This is how we stop being critical citizens and become digital idiots. The word idiot here is not an insult, it's a concept. In ancient Greece, idiotes was the person who withdrew from public life to live only in their private sphere. It was the person who didn't take part in debate, politics, or community. Today, something similar is happening. We're locked inside confirmation bubbles, fed with content that only reinforces what we already think. It's ignorance dressed up as wisdom, misinformation packaged as truth, opinion turned into absolute certainty. And this is exactly what Foucault meant by the link between knowledge and power. Knowledge is never neutral. It's always tied to power. It defines who has the authority to speak, what can be said, and what will count as truth. On social media, this logic is amplified. Knowledge is no longer built mainly by experts or public debate. It's manufactured by algorithms that prioritize engagement, not quality. What goes viral is what stirs emotion, not what clarifies. What triggers a reaction, not what provokes reflection. And that's how armies of confident idiots are formed. People who never studied a topic but feel qualified to speak about everything. People who don't have doubts, they have takes. Foucault would say, this is no accident. It's strategy. It's a technology of power. Because a population broken into emotional bubbles is incapable of building a shared truth. And without shared truth, there is no politics, only conflict. The digital society creates a new kind of domination, invisible because it looks like freedom, efficient because each person polices and shapes themselves, profitable because every click is monetized, and dangerous because it erodes critical thinking. There is no room left for contemplation, for doubt, for silence. We live in permanent reaction mode. And the digital subject, shaped by this environment, doesn't think. They react. They don't question. They share. They don't listen. They perform. Where there is power, there is resistance. But that resistance is only possible if there is awareness. So what happens when awareness is hijacked by platforms? When our very perception of the world is filtered by personalized bubbles? When reality is broken into timelines and each group lives inside its own parallel truth? The answer is clear. Ignorance becomes structural. It's no longer about lack of access to information. It's about an excess of confirmation. This creates people who are easy to manipulate because they're sure of everything and listen to no one. The new digital idiot is not absent. They're active, present, engaged, but unable to think outside their feedback loop. This is the triumph of a kind of power that no longer needs to repress. It just has to give the user exactly what they already want to hear. The cell has been replaced by the timeline, punishment by the like, censorship by distraction. In this setup, truth becomes a matter of volume, not consistency. Whoever has more reach wins. Popularity becomes a synonym for authority, and criticism becomes a synonym for hate. Foucault already hinted at this when he said that the most basic political struggle is over the definition of truth. Whoever controls truth, what can be said, what can be heard, what counts as real, controls the world. Today, that battle takes place on digital battlefields, and the winner is not reason, it's the algorithm. But is there a way out? Foucault doesn't give us easy answers. He didn't believe in some final, total liberation, but he did believe in the possibility of resistance. And that resistance starts with thinking against yourself, doubting your own bubble, distrusting what feels too comfortable, creating silence before reacting. To resist, in this context, is to seek what doesn't simply confirm you, to listen to people who think differently, to look for complexity where everything is being simplified. It means refusing to be just a data-shaped profile and fighting to remain a subject. Because digital idiocy is useful to the system, but lucidity is dangerous. It pops the bubble. It disrupts the flow. It slows down consumption. It creates thought. And thinking, in the end, is the most subversive act there is. There's something deeply unsettling about human beings. We don't really know what we want until we see someone else wanting it. That's the core provocation of French thinker Ren Girard, whose theory of mimetic desire exposes an almost invisible side of modern stupidity, our inability to desire on our own, in things hidden. Since the foundation of the world, Girard digs into his critique of civilization, showing how, from ancient myths to modern consumer culture, unconscious imitation shapes our passions, rivalries, and violences. Desire is not autonomous, it is triangular. I desire what the other desires. That's the starting point. We don't simply desire objects, we desire what someone else desires. It's not really about the car, or the lifestyle, or the ideology. It's about the fact that someone we admire or envy wants that thing. Then, without noticing, we start wanting it too. Girard calls this mimetic desire. The problem is that this kind of desire has no inner root. It doesn't come from reflection or authenticity. It's reactive, automatic, imitative. And the more people desire the same things, fame, prestige, power, status, possessions, the more they become rivals, because there's a limited supply of desirable objects, and that's where mimetic conflict begins. What starts as admiration turns into competition, what looked harmless turns into resentment, and almost inevitably, rivalry spreads. This is the hidden mechanism of mimetic stupidity. We don't really know why we're fighting. We just know the other person has what we want, thinks what we hate, or represents what we feel threatened by. And then we start copying even their hate. Girard shows how this logic infects the whole of society. It's in social media, in politics, in advertising, in culture wars. We're surrounded by images, narratives, influencers, and groups telling us what's desirable. And our mimetic tendency pushes us to copy, desire, compete, and hate, without knowing why. And that's the perfect soil for stupidity, because the mimetic person doesn't think, they repeat. They don't desire, they copy. They don't judge, they follow. They build opinions, identities, passions, and beliefs based on whatever they see others doing. The result? Crowds that move together, shout together, buy together, cancel together, and don't really know why they're doing it. Mimesis produces an indistinguishable mass where everyone imitates everyone, and no one feels responsible for anything. That's why Girard warns, uncontrolled imitation leads to violence, not because humans are naturally violent, but because mimetic desire creates growing tensions, impossible rivalries, and symbolic disputes that need a culprit. That's when the scapegoat mechanism kicks in. When society hits a crisis point, when mimetic tensions become unbearable, People look for a common enemy to dump their collective frustration on. And that enemy can be a person, a group, a minority, a symbol, someone who will be sacrificed so that peace can be restored. That's how the mimetic crowd solves its crises, by channeling violence. And the scariest part is, it feels just, it feels necessary, it feels moral. After all, everyone sees that this person or group is the problem, right? But in reality, nobody's thinking. They're just imitating each other. That's the core of mimetic stupidity, a collective ignorance moving with absolute confidence. It never asks, where does my desire come from? Why do I hate this person? What am I really chasing? Instead, it acts with total certainty, and that's exactly what makes it so dangerous. Today, you can see this clearly on social media. Every like, every comment, every trending topic is a thermometer of collective desire, and often of collective hysteria. People rally around causes, cancellations, trends, outrage, not because they thought deeply about them, but because they saw others doing the same. Politics is deeply mimetic too. Charismatic leaders don't just attract rational support, they awaken desire for identification. Their followers want what they want, hate who they hate, repeat their words, wear their colors, imitate their gestures. There's no real debate. There's mirroring. And consumer culture, of course, is a mimetic playground. The brand, the lifestyle, the trip, the ideal body, all of it becomes an object of desire because someone else already desires it. And it spreads like a fever, an endless race towards some image of success no one can really explain, but everyone wants to reach. Mimetic desire is the hidden engine of human passions, and its destructive power grows when no one realizes they are imitating. That's exactly what makes mimetic desire a form of stupidity, the lack of clarity. The person thinks they're being authentic, but they're just being influenced. They think they're being critical, but they're just copying someone else's criticism. They think they're fighting for something just, but they're just repeating a collective movement without thinking. So what do we do with this? Girard doesn't offer a neat, easy solution, but he does point to a path: awareness. The first step out of the mimetic cycle is realizing it exists. It's recognizing that our desires are not as original as we imagine, that our opinions are shaped by our environment, that our passions are often inherited reactions. This recognition takes humility. It takes stopping. It takes asking, why do I want what I want? Where is this resentment coming from? Am I acting from conviction or from imitation? At that moment, a person can start reclaiming their own uniqueness. They can begin to desire in a freer, more conscious, more ethical way. They can break the pattern of scapegoating, of joining the attacking crowd, of feeding the collective stupidity that devours everything. Girard sees in the figure of Christ, the one unjustly crucified who breaks the cycle of violence, a symbol of this overcoming. He is the one who refuses the scapegoat logic. He exposes the mechanism. He disarms mimetic hatred. And in doing so, he opens space for a new kind of human relationship, based not on rivalry, but on compassion. But that takes courage. Because thinking for yourself is swimming against the desire of the group. It's being seen as weird, arrogant, or a traitor. That's why mimetic stupidity is so tempting. It offers instant belonging, at the cost of clarity. In the end, the choice is between the comfort of the herd and the inner conflict of conscience. Because only those who face their own desire can step out of the crowd. And only those who step out of the crowd can finally see that many of the battles they were fighting were never really theirs in the first place. In a time flooded with loud certainties and heated opinions, the quiet figure of Socrates still challenges us. The philosopher who never wrote a single book, who only asked questions, who irritated the powerful and challenged the wise of the city, became a symbol of a paradoxical kind of wisdom, the one that starts by recognizing ignorance. I know that I know nothing. This sentence, attributed to Socrates, is often repeated without the weight it really carries. In its original context, it's not some fake humility, It's a radical act of clarity. Socrates isn't saying he literally knows nothing in an absolute sense. He's saying that, faced with the complexity of life, truth, justice, and the human soul, the most honest attitude is to recognize how much we still don't know. And that stands in direct contrast to the figure of the confident ignorant, the person who doesn't know but believes they know, the one who speaks with absolute certainty, even when they're neck-deep in misunderstandings, the one who rejects any doubt, nuance, or complexity, because they live off the illusion of certainty. It was exactly against this kind of stupidity, the stupidity of baseless conviction, that Socrates devoted his life. In the Apology of Socrates, written by Plato, we see the philosopher defending himself against the accusations that would lead to his death, corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods of the city. But what's really on trial isn't just Socrates, it's the very act of thinking. During his defense, Socrates says that his friend Chaerephon went to the oracle of Delphi, and the answer was clear. No one is wiser than Socrates. Confused and skeptical, Socrates sets out to understand what that meant. He goes to poets, politicians, craftsmen, orators, and discovers something disturbing. They all spoke with confidence, but none of them really knew what they were talking about. They confused opinion with knowledge. They confused social status with wisdom. They confused good rhetoric with truth. Socrates, on the other hand, realized that his superiority came down to one thing. He knew that he didn't know. This awareness of ignorance is, for Plato, the first step toward real wisdom. It's not a paralyzing, cynical doubt. It's an openness to learning. Only the person who recognizes their ignorance is actually willing to learn. Only the one who doubts is able to think. Only the one who listens can grow. The confident ignorant, on the other hand, locks themselves inside their certainties, and with that, they become almost immune to knowledge. They turn ignorance into a fortress, and stupidity into identity. This difference between the wise person who questions and the fool who asserts with certainty is at the heart of Socratic thought, and it's brutally relevant today. We live surrounded by loud voices, quick opinions, instant judgments. Everyone has a take, a position, an unshakable certainty, but very few are willing to face aporia, that Socratic state of confusion, when you realize your beliefs don't really hold up. Socrates led his conversation partners straight into that breaking point. He asked questions, dug into contradictions, and dismantled speeches, not to humiliate people, but to expose the emptiness of groundless certainty. This method, maieutic, is about helping the other give birth to their own ideas through dialogue, doubt, and investigation. But for that to work, you need intellectual humility. You need to admit that maybe you're not right, that maybe the other person has something to teach you, that maybe your worldview is incomplete, and that attitude takes courage, which is exactly what the confident ignorant lacks. They don't want to know, they want to win, they don't want to understand, they want to be right. They're not after truth, they're after self-confirmation. And that's where the most dangerous kind of stupidity is born, proud stupidity, the kind that refuses to learn. That turns ignorance into a flag, that treats thinking as a threat, that mocks anyone who doubts, questions, or doesn't have a ready-made answer. The greatest good for a man is to discuss virtue every day and to examine himself and others. For Socrates, the real good is thinking, constantly examining life, choices, and beliefs. The unexamined life is not worth living, probably the most powerful line from his trial. It calls out what most people would rather avoid, responsibility for their own thinking. In the Republic, Plato, through Socrates, goes even deeper. There he presents the allegory of the cave, people chained, watching shadows on a wall, taking them for reality. When one of them is freed and sees the real world, he realizes that everything he knew before was just illusion. When he goes back to tell the others, they laugh at him, No one wants to leave their shadows. This myth perfectly sums up the stupidity of certainty. It's easier to believe in a comfortable illusion than to face a disturbing truth. The freed prisoner represents the philosopher, the thinker, the restless one, but the others prefer the comfort of ignorance. That's how many people live today, in a cave of ready-made opinions, rigid ideologies, inherited certainties, and anything that challenges those shadows is treated as a threat. Socrates offers us the exact opposite, a life of seeking, a mind that stays open, a spirit that questions even itself. And this active humility is what separates the wise from the foolish. The wise person isn't someone who stays quiet out of insecurity. It's someone who speaks with an awareness of their limits, who listens, who asks, who doubts themselves more than they doubt others. The confident ignorant, on the other hand, lives inside a bubble. They don't listen. They react. They don't think. They repeat. They don't seek. They accuse. And the less solid their knowledge is, the more aggressive their certainty becomes. That's why Socrates' wisdom is still revolutionary, because it doesn't hand you easy answers. It demands that you take responsibility for your own thinking, and thinking takes time, silence, inner conflict. It's not instant, it's not automatic, it's not content, it's an act of resistance. Today, society rewards the shout, the viral clip, the slogan, the absolute take, but clarity lives in the gaps. In "I don't know," in "let's see," in "maybe I'm wrong," and in a world obsessed with being right, that is an act of courage. Socrates didn't die because he committed some crime. He died because he was uncomfortable, because he asked too many questions, because he doubted everything, because he pulled people out of the comfort of confident ignorance. And even today, he would likely still be silenced, cancelled, mocked, called annoying. But he left us a powerful legacy, the right and the duty to think. We live in times so cynical that purity looks like stupidity, kindness looks like weakness, sensitivity looks like a flaw. In a culture where being clever matters more than integrity, and emotional coldness is mistaken for strength, it's no surprise that innocent people get called idiots. That's exactly what Fyodor Dostoevsky exposes in one of his most moving and disturbing novels, The Idiot. The main character, Prince Mishkin, returns to Russia after years of medical treatment in Switzerland for epilepsy. He's described as simple, honest, sensitive, and deeply good. But as soon as he comes into contact with Russian society, marked by vanity, self-interest, power games, and emotional corruption, his goodness is immediately read as madness, or worse, as idiocy. Many times we call someone an idiot simply because they are too pure for this world. Dostoevsky's great experiment is this. What would happen if a truly good man, almost a modern Christ, appeared among us? Would he be admired or destroyed? The answer in The Idiot is devastating. He would be crushed. Mishkin is a character who unsettles us because he doesn't play social games. He doesn't pretend. He doesn't manipulate. He doesn't act out of self-interest. He tells the truth gently. He forgives easily. He suffers with other people's pain. He loves without possessiveness. He doesn't want to beat anyone. And because of that, everyone around him sees him as weak, strange, inconvenient. The society in the novel is going through a spiritual crisis. People live on appearances, chasing status, prestige, money, or revenge. Human relationships are marked by distrust, competition, and pride. No one is transparent. No one is generous without calculation. In that kind of corrupted world, purity becomes a threat. By acting with empathy and honesty, Mishkin exposes the collective lie everyone else is living in. He doesn't even need to accuse anyone. His very presence is a mirror, and that makes people deeply uncomfortable. Goodness irritates more than evil. Evil is predictable, but goodness disarms us. The saddest part is that Mishkin isn't trying to prove anything. He doesn't want to convince anyone. He doesn't want to change the world. He just is, and that alone is enough for people to see him as an idiot. What Dostoevsky is really doing here is a deep diagnosis of the human soul. We've become so used to cynicism that we no longer recognize purity when it shows up. Worse, we start to despise it. A cynical society is one that no longer believes in virtues. It sees kindness as naivety. It sees compassion as weakness. It sees sincerity as foolishness. It lives on the assumption that everyone has a hidden agenda, and when someone appears who breaks that logic, we'd rather discredit that person than let ourselves be challenged. Prince Myshkin is that breaking point. He interrupts the usual flow of vanity. He responds with gentleness where coldness is expected. He responds with forgiveness where revenge is expected. That makes him an idiot in other people's eyes, but a mirror for the reader. The question that remains is, who is really the idiot? The good man, or the society that can't accept him? That reversal is the heart of the novel. Dostoevsky forces us to face the fact that our culture punishes virtue, and it doesn't just punish it with mockery, but with exclusion, isolation, and symbolic violence. Throughout the book, Myshkin is slowly swallowed up by other people's madness. His love for Nastasia Filipovna, a complex woman torn between the desire for redemption and self-destruction, is another example of his compassion. He doesn't want to save her out of ego, but because he sees her as a human being worthy of love, despite everything. But even she can't accept that love. She is so broken inside, so ashamed of herself, that she rejects the possibility of being loved without calculation. In the end, that's what leads to tragedy. Purity is unbearable for those who've learned to live in filth. The pain that runs through the novel is existential. The pain of realizing the world doesn't really want to be healed. That truth hurts. That moral beauty isn't recognized. That goodness bothers people more than evil does. Because goodness shows us just how distorted we've become. Dostoevsky wrote The Idiot as an attempt to create a truly Christian character. Not Christian in a narrow religious or dogmatic sense, but in an ethical, spiritual, existential way. A good man in a world that has lost its sense of the good. But this man doesn't triumph. He is rejected, ridiculed, misunderstood. In the end, he loses his mind, and that madness is symbolic. It's the price paid for refusing to fit into the logic of cynicism. Myshkin is not foolish, he is radically human, but in a dehumanized culture, that becomes unbearable. Today, the idiot is still a painfully relevant warning. How many times do we see generous people being written off as naive? How often do we confuse empathy with weakness? How often do we laugh at kindness, as if it was something childish for people who are too innocent? We live in a time when the slick operator is praised. The emotionally cold person is respected. The calculating person is admired, and the sensitive, vulnerable, transparent one is pushed aside. Myshkin's character reminds us of something essential. Real intelligence is not about beating others. It's about not losing yourself. The wisdom Dostoevsky offers is not the wisdom of sharp comebacks, social manipulation, or emotional control. It's the wisdom of love, listening, and humility. And that kind of wisdom has no place in a world driven by vanity, ambition, and competition. That's why it gets labeled idiotic. But maybe the real idiot is the one who thinks kindness is weakness, who thinks loving is just being vulnerable, who thinks living with integrity is being naive. The challenge Dostoevsky throws at us is deep. Can you handle purity? Or are you already so used to the social game, to the theatre of masks, that you'd rather laugh at Prince Myshkin than let yourself be moved by him? Modern stupidity, in this sense, isn't just a lack of thinking. It's a refusal to feel. It's contempt for moral beauty. It's mocking virtue. Myshkin may have been called an idiot, but in a cynical society, maybe only an idiot can truly see clearly. Human suffering doesn't come only from pain. It's not just about loss, scarcity, or injustice. According to Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, the real root of suffering is ignorance. But not just any ignorance, a deep, spiritual kind of ignorance, subtle and often invisible even to the one who suffers. An ignorance that makes us cling to illusions about ourselves, about others, and about reality itself. In the Buddhist tradition, This ignorance is called avidya, from Sanskrit, a sactus negation, vidya, psych-knowledge. Avidya isn't just not knowing in an intellectual sense. It's a distorted way of seeing the world, a kind of blindness of consciousness, a confusion between what is temporary and what we think is eternal, between what is empty and what we treat as absolute. It's because we don't understand the true nature of things that beings keep turning on the wheel of suffering. This spiritual ignorance for Buddha is the foundation of all human pain. It sits at the root of desire, attachment, fear, pride, and anger. Not because these feelings are morally wrong, but because they grow out of a mistaken view of reality. We imagine things are permanent, that we're in control, that we are a fixed, solid self, separate from the world. And we spend our whole lives trying to protect that illusion. We want to guarantee security, hold on to relationships, defend a certain self-image. But everything slips away, everything changes, everything is impermanent. And the more we resist this impermanence, the more we suffer. That's what the Buddha teaches in the Four Noble Truths, the core of his philosophy. Life involves suffering, dukkha. Suffering has a cause, desire and attachment. There is a way out of suffering, the ending of desire. That way is the Noble Eightfold Path, a way of living based on ethics, meditation, and wisdom. But the key point here is, the desire that traps us is born from ignorance. It's avidya that feeds the illusion that the world can fully satisfy us. It's avidya that makes us identify with thoughts and emotions as if they were our true essence. It's avidya that creates the illusion of a separate, fixed I that must be defended at all costs. This kind of stupidity, because that's what avidya really is, at the end of the day, a spiritual stupidity, doesn't show up as shouting. It shows up as habit, as the unconscious repetition of mental patterns, as resistance to change, as a compulsive search for pleasure and success, as a refusal to look inward. The spiritually ignorant person is not someone without faith or without religion. It's someone who, even while living, never really wakes up to what's real. They live on autopilot. They react without awareness. They get offended easily. They constantly need to prove they're right. And they suffer. They suffer a lot. But instead of investigating where that suffering comes from, they blame the world, other people, fate. And they keep spinning on the wheel of samsara, the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, driven by ignorance and attachment. Just as the lotus flower grows out of the mud, wisdom can grow out of ignorance, if there is awareness. Spiritual ignorance is not a moral failure, but an existential condition. Everyone is born into it. A child identifies with the body, then with a name, with desires, with emotions. We grow up building an idea of who we are, made of memories, judgments, and stories. And we take that as absolute. But the Buddha invites us to look deeper. Who are we, really? Are we the thoughts that appear in the mind? Are we the emotions that pass through us? Are we the image other people have of us? Are we the successes and failures we've collected? For Buddha, all of that is ignorance, because the self, this I we try to defend, is a construction, a conditioned, impermanent phenomenon, empty of its own fixed essence. It exists, yes, but not as a solid entity, more as a process, constantly changing. What you call self is just a combination of body, sensations, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. And it's this illusory I that wants, clings, fears, and suffers. Spiritual ignorance, then, is living as if this I were absolutely real, and building your whole life around it, defending your image, feeding your ego, chasing pleasure and avoiding pain in its name, competing, lying, bragging, and of course blaming the world when things don't go the way it wants. That's how arrogance, spiritual pride, fanaticism, resentment, and envy are born. All of these are symptoms of a mind that doesn't understand the emptiness of existence, a mind that doesn't see how everything is connected, a mind still clinging to a personal storyline that hurts every time it's threatened. And here we find the root of spiritual stupidity, believing everything the mind says, taking thoughts as truth, taking emotions as identity, taking desires as needs. That's why Buddha said, liberation doesn't come from worship, blind obedience, or dogmas. It comes from clarity. The path out of ignorance is not lighting candles or making promises. It's learning to see clearly, to meditate, to observe, to deconstruct the self, to let go of illusions, to cultivate compassion, to practice presence. It's a path of self-knowledge, but also of going beyond the self, because when we see that the I is empty, we also see that the other is not really separate from us, that there is no way to be truly happy at the expense of someone else's pain, that everything is interconnected, that every action has consequences. Ignorance is the night of the mind, but it's a night that can turn into dawn. Awakening, in Buddhism, is exactly that, going beyond avidya, stepping out of the darkness of the ego and seeing reality as it is, impermanent, interconnected, empty and full at the same time. And this awakening is not some unreachable mystical state. It starts in small things, in the silence before you react, in conscious breathing, in deep listening, in genuine compassion, in loosening your grip on your own thoughts. Spiritual ignorance is subtle. It disguises itself as wisdom. It shows up in inflated speeches, absolute certainties, and truths that can't be questioned. But it dissolves when we face reality with attention, humility, and honesty. Because the opposite of avidya is not more information, it's wisdom. And wisdom here doesn't mean being highly educated. It means a different way of seeing, a different way of being, a way of existing with less attachment, fewer illusions, and less suffering. In times of noise, inflated egos, and spiritual competition, Buddha's teaching stands like a quiet lighthouse. Don't run away from suffering. Investigate it. Don't look for ready-made truths. Watch the mind. Don't believe everything you think. Look at what's underneath it, because suffering may be unavoidable, but ignorance doesn't have to last forever. In a society where cleverness is celebrated, dishonor is tolerated, and selfishness has turned into a lifestyle, Confucius's words sound almost like an old whisper from a more noble time. But it's exactly in this quiet voice that he gives us one of the most urgent lessons for today. When virtue is lost, the fool thrives. Confucius lived in China in the 6th century BCE, during a period of moral breakdown, internal wars, and political decay, a time when people had stopped respecting rituals, traditions, elders, rulers, and above all, had forgotten how to live with integrity. Not because there were no laws, but because there was no character. When there is righteousness in the heart, there is beauty in the character. When there is beauty in the character, there is harmony in the home. When there is harmony in the home, there is order in the nation. When there is order in the nation, there is peace in the world. For Confucius, the real foundation of society is not force or law or technique. It's virtue. The individual's ability to act with honor, respect, responsibility, and empathy. The word for this in Chinese is dai, moral virtue, a kind of inner brightness that guides your behavior even when no one is watching. Losing this virtue produces a very specific kind of stupidity. The characterless fool, the one who doesn't think about the consequences of their actions, who acts on impulse, self-interest, or blind imitation, who feels no shame in doing wrong because they've already lost their sense of what's right. This person isn't evil in the classic sense. Very often they're funny, nice, popular, but morally they're empty. They act without reflection, without honor, without care for others. They live only for themselves and are incapable of taking real responsibility for anything. The noble man thinks of virtue, the petty man thinks of profit. This distinction is central to Confucian thought. the noble person, Yunzi, and the small person, Xiaoren. The first cultivates spirit, character, and inner coherence. The second moves only for advantage, convenience, or vanity. And the more virtue fades, the more these small men take up space in positions of power, in politics, in the media, in companies, on social networks. The result? A culture where respect is seen as weakness, ethics is mocked as moralism, and the opportunist becomes a role model. Confucius saw this process as a kind of spiritual disease, a silent decay that starts in the individual, spreads to the family, then to the city, and finally to the empire. Because for him, everything starts with personal conduct. No one can change the world without first learning to govern themselves. If a person is not true to their word, they will not be respected, and one who is not respected cannot inspire others. The characterless fool is exactly the one who doesn't govern themselves. They're a slave to their own emotions, impulses, and convenience. Their opinions change with the wind. They chase applause, not integrity. They use noble words, but act in petty ways. Their ignorance is not just intellectual, it's moral. And worse, they no longer feel shame. That's the critical point for Confucius. Shame, qi, is a key emotion in Eastern thought, not as repression, but as an inner guide for behavior. When a person does wrong and feels shame, they are still connected to virtue. But when they lie, humiliate, or cheat, and still feel proud of it, it means their soul is already corrupted. Feeling ashamed of doing wrong is a sign of nobility, not feeling it is a sign of ruin. This hits painfully close to home today. We live in a time where the idea of shame has been replaced by likes, where scandal becomes content, where lying is a strategy, where arrogance is confused with authenticity, where humiliating others is entertainment. And what we see multiplying is a generation of shameless fools. Not fools because they lack information, but because they lack character, inner breaks, and ethical awareness. People who no longer know what is right or worse, no longer care. For Confucius, this is a collective danger, because without a reference point of virtue, human relationships start to fall apart. Bonds become superficial. Words lose their weight. Any real sense of community disappears. Then comes moral chaos, a society where everyone talks, few listen, and nobody takes responsibility, where each person chases their own gain, but no one cares for the whole, where even leaders, who should be examples, act like vain fools. If the ruler is upright, the people will follow his uprightness. But if he is corrupt, how can we expect the people to be just? Confucius's philosophy is not a moralistic rulebook. It's a call to awareness, an invitation for each person to look at themselves honestly and ask, have I been living with integrity? Have I acted with respect? Have I been cultivating virtue? Or just chasing advantages? And more, am I surrounded by people who inspire nobility, or by fools who are proud of their own ignorance? Change starts in the closest circle, in the family, among friends, with co-workers. Virtue, for Confucius, is not something grand and flashy. It's everyday. It's in your tone of voice, in how you greet people, in how you keep your word, in gratitude, in the constant effort to be a little better than you were yesterday. The true noble person does not demand from others what they do not demand from themselves. And maybe this is the root of characterless stupidity, expecting from others what you don't live yourself, judging, pointing fingers, making demands, without doing your own moral work. It's easy to criticize the world. It's hard to reform your own heart. In the end, Confucius's message is as simple as it is powerful. Without virtue, there is no civilization. Without character, no system will stand for long. Technical progress, laws, institutions, all of that collapses if the individual loses their sense of honor. And when society fills up with people who have no ethical breaks, stupidity becomes systemic. It shows up in the normalization of lying, the acceptance of corruption, the worship of ego. And the worst part, all of this is lived as if it were normal, but it's not. We can still choose another path. We can still recover sacred shame, quiet integrity, and a kind of honor that doesn't need to be displayed. We can still let ourselves be guided by the teachings of a sage who, more than 2,000 years ago, was already warning, a society without virtue is a society on the edge of collapse. Confucius doesn't shout, he whispers. But anyone who still has ears for wisdom knows, his whisper is worth more than 1,000 speeches. We live surrounded by noise, shouting, opinions, heated speeches, canned phrases, instant certainties. We live in a time when everyone talks, but almost no one listens. Everyone has an opinion, but few really understand. In this flood of empty talk, the teaching of Lao-Tse, the Taoist master from the 6th century BCE, comes like a breath of clear silence. Those who know do not speak. Those who speak do not know. This is one of the most unsettling and powerful lines from the Tao Te Ching. Lao-Tse isn't saying that silence is some trick to manipulate people or a pose of spiritual superiority. He's pointing to a deep wisdom about language, ego, and awareness. The true sage doesn't need to prove anything. He doesn't cling to words to be right, and he doesn't use speech to dominate others. He understands that the world, the Tao, the essence of things, doesn't fit inside definitions. And the more we try to describe what can't be put into words, the more we distort it. The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. For Lao-Tse, speech is a limited tool. Useful, yes, but dangerous when used without awareness. Too many words are a sign of imbalance. When a fool talks too much, he's not trying to bring clarity. He's trying to make himself feel important. He's trying to cover up his ignorance with volume, excess, and performance. And honestly, what's more common today than that? We live in the age of non-stop talking, social media where the main value is having something to say all the time. Impulsive comments, instant judgment, short videos, quick takes, ready-made slogans. Thought has become content. Wisdom has become branding. Depth has turned into performance. But as Lao-Tse warned, the more noise there is, the less clarity. The more we shout, the less we understand. The more we try to control everything with words, the further we get from the Tao, the natural flow of existence. The sage is like water. He adapts, doesn't fight, doesn't resist. He remains. The sage's silence is not cowardice or indifference. It's an active silence, full of awareness. He listens more than he talks. He observes more than he judges. He lets things show their true nature without forcing, without manipulating, without jumping to conclusions. The fool, on the other hand, talks just to feel like somebody. He can't handle the emptiness of not knowing, so he fills the space with loose phrases, half-digested theories, borrowed opinions. He believes that talking a lot is the same as being intelligent, but all he really does is complicate what is simple and confuse what could be clear. The fool clings to words. The sage rests in silence. The chatter of fools is chaotic, restless, anxious. It doesn't seek wisdom. It seeks attention. It doesn't seek connection. It seeks control. It's mental noise turned into verbal noise, spreading ignorance with the confidence of someone who thinks they're saving the world. You can see this everywhere. In politics, with leaders who talk too much and listen too little. On the internet, with influencers who have an opinion about everything and understand almost nothing. In relationships, with people who compete to be right instead of trying to understand each other. And the more we speak without thinking, the more our minds go numb, the further we move from direct perception, from intuition, from the subtle truth of things. For Lao-Tse, the Tao, the ultimate reality, the eternal principle, is not taught through words. It's taught through presence, through example, through fertile silence. The sage influences others not by what he says, but by the way he walks, breathes, and acts. The sage leads without dominating, teaches without words, transforms without forcing. This turns our modern idea of communication upside down. It's not by talking more that you reach more people, but by talking less and listening better. It's not by forcing yourself on others that you inspire them, but by moving lightly, with coherence and humility. In Lao-Tse's wisdom, true speech rises out of inner silence. When the mind is calm and the ego is at peace, our words become simple, direct, and helpful. When the mind is chaotic, inflated by pride or fear, our words turn noisy, useless, and destructive. And maybe this is one of the clearest signs of modern stupidity: unconscious talking. The inability to be quiet, to listen to others, to sit with something before having an opinion. The compulsion to say something, even when there's nothing true to say. The sage, according to the Tao, doesn't compete with fools. He doesn't jump into verbal battles. He doesn't try to win by shouting. He knows time reveals everything. He knows the truth doesn't need to force its way. It shows itself, like water finding a path even through stone. That's why the sage's silence is not absence, it's power. A force that holds, watches, and transforms without violence. A wisdom that doesn't need a spotlight because it lives in harmony with the Tao. He who stays centered in the Tao is not shaken by the confusion of men. Today, seeking this kind of silence is an act of resistance, turning down the outer and inner noise. Not reacting right away. Breathing before you answer. Watching before you judge. Reflecting before you post. Listening, not just with your ears, but with your heart. Silence is not emptiness. It's the fertile space where listening, intuition, and wisdom are born. It's there that we connect with the Tao, with the deeper order of life that doesn't need to be explained, only lived. Lao-Tse didn't ask us to be quiet out of fear or submission. He invites us into silence as an inner discipline, a way to make room for what really matters, a way to clear the mind of the ego's constant chatter and tune ourselves to the rhythm of existence. In a world full of voices fighting for attention, real power is knowing when not to speak. And even more, knowing that not knowing is the beginning of true wisdom. A human being, as an individual, is capable of reflecting, weighing things, holding back, choosing what's good. But the moment this person steps into a crowd, something inside them changes completely. It's as if their identity evaporates, as if their reason dissolves into the collective shout. From that point on, they're no longer an individual. They're part of a shapeless body, driven by impulses, by the urge to merge, to destroy, to belong. And it's exactly this dangerous transformation that Elias Canetti warns us about in his masterwork, Crowds and Power. Canetti's reflection, written over decades in the 20th century, is a brutal diagnosis of the blind force that crowds represent. It's a philosophical, psychological, and sociological essay, but also an existential warning. When the individual fuses with the crowd, their stupidity is amplified. It becomes aggressive, contagious, and often uncontrollable. Nothing scares a person more than being touched by the unknown. This line may sound like just an anthropological observation, but it hides a key to understanding the behavior of crowds. The fear of loneliness, of vulnerability, of being isolated. By joining a crowd, the individual feels protected, untouchable, powerful. But at the same time, they give up responsibility and awareness. The crowd, for Canetti, is where criticism dies, where no one has to justify their action, where anonymity gets you drunk, where stupidity spreads like wildfire. A stupidity that isn't just passive ignorance, but brute force, intolerance, and a desire to wipe things out. How many times have we seen this in history? People who, on their own, would never be capable of committing atrocities, but inside a crowd become capable of destroying, lynching, burning, screaming for blood. The crowd shouts justice, but behaves like a beast. It claims to seek redemption, but wants revenge. It screams for freedom, but demands blind obedience. And in this paradox, reason is suffocated. In the crowd, everyone is equal, but that equality doesn't free you, it traps you. The feeling of equality inside the crowd is a trick. It doesn't lift anyone up. It drags everyone down to the same level. It's an equality of submission, not dignity. Each person stops being someone and becomes something, a tiny piece of a bigger force. And in this dilution of the self, multiplied stupidity is born. Because without individual awareness, there is no real thinking, only reaction. And the reaction of crowds is always emotional, primitive, immediate. The crowd doesn't wait, doesn't weigh, doesn't listen. It judges, demands, condemns. It doesn't need proof, only a target. Canetti describes this transformation as something almost ritual. The crowd needs to form, grow, choose an enemy, and then release its energy through destruction. It's a kind of collective catharsis, where stupidity dresses itself up as morality. This is a crucial point. The crowd always believes it's on the right side. It feels morally authorized to act. But this morality is only on the surface, built out of slogans, symbols, catchphrases. It's a morality without reflection, an ethics without thought. And that makes it dangerous. A crowd isn't just a bunch of people standing together. It's an entity with a life of its own. And like any irrational entity, it can be manipulated, and almost always is. Authoritarian politicians, demagogues, charismatic leaders, they all know it's easier to manipulate a crowd than a single person. The crowd doesn't resist, doesn't doubt, doesn't question. It wants to believe. It wants to follow. And because of that, control over it becomes absolute, as long as the right words, symbols, and fears are used. Power fears thought, but loves the masses. In the crowd, power finds the perfect ground to keep itself alive. And stupidity, that lack of criticism, that abandonment of discernment, turns into a tool of domination. A people that screams together without knowing why is a people that's easy to control. Just look around. Mass movements that destroy in the name of order, and at protests that turn into riots. Social media turning into a courtroom. Groups acting like a steamroller, not listening, not thinking, not backing down. It's collective irrationality dressed up as justice. And Canetti warns us, this energy is never harmless. Even when it starts with good intentions, the crowd tends to spin out of control. Because its logic isn't reason, it's instinct, fury, contagion. When an individual steps into a crowd, they don't bring their clarity with them. They bring their anger, their frustration, their desire to merge. And inside that crowd, they feel strong because they're part of something bigger. But that feeling of strength is an illusion. It comes at a cost, the cost of their own awareness. The stupidity of crowds, then, isn't just a cognitive failure. It's an unconscious choice for comfort, safety, and belonging, even if that means sacrificing the truth. Because thinking hurts. Making choices alone is scary. Going against the flow takes courage. And it's much easier to repeat what everyone says, act how everyone acts, judge the way everyone judges. In the crowd, no one thinks. Everyone hides in the numbers. But Canetti also suggests that this blind force can be contained, not through repression, but by educating awareness, by strengthening individual reason, by cultivating independent thought, by encouraging listening, dialogue, and questioning. The antidote to the violent stupidity of crowds is not forced silence. It's the awakening of the individual, the person who knows themselves, who questions, who doesn't get carried away by every shout, the person who has the courage to stand alone if needed, who doesn't need to hide inside a crowd to exist, who would rather think than just repeat. And this is maybe the biggest challenge of our time, to recover the value of individual awareness in the middle of collective noise, to teach young people to think for themselves, to encourage debate without rage, to value listening more than shouting. Because every time we let the group think for us, we hand over the keys to our clarity. And history shows us, in blood, that crowds can do absolutely anything as long as they feel they have permission. The question that remains is, how many times have we taken part in this without noticing? How many times have we been part of the crowd, of a symbolic lynching, of a group judgment, of an angry post, of collective fury? Canetti invites us to an act of lucidity. Don't be fooled by the heat of the crowd. Truth doesn't live in numbers or unanimity. It lives in quiet reflection, in honest doubt, in the kind of thinking that refuses to get lost. The crowd screams, but conscience whispers, and in that whisper, maybe, lies the only real hope against stupidity multiplied by 1,000. Education can be liberating, or it can tame people. It can awaken consciousness, or numb it. It can shape lucid citizens, or just obedient subjects who are unable to question the world around them. For Paulo Freire, one of the greatest thinkers of critical pedagogy in the 20th century, this choice is not neutral or innocent. It's an ethical, political, and deeply existential choice. In his most influential work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo Freire gives us an idea that's as simple as it is revolutionary. There is no such thing as education without a purpose. Every way of teaching carries a view of the world. Every school does train people for the market, but also, and mainly, for a certain type of human being we want to create. And that's where the tragedy of institutionalized stupidity begins. Education either functions as an instrument which is used to facilitate integration of the younger generation into the logic of the present system, or it becomes the practice of freedom. Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. In other words, education can be a tool of oppression or of liberation. It can be used to keep everything as it is, or to spark change in the world. But how exactly do we reproduce stupidity through education? Paulo Freire identifies what he calls banking education, a model where the teacher deposits ready-made content into students' minds as if they were empty vaults. In this model, there is no dialogue, only transfer, no listening, only imposition, no critical thinking, only memorization. The student is not the subject of learning, but a passive container. Their job is to repeat, memorize, obey. The goal is not to think, but to fit in. And this kind of teaching, still dominant in so many schools, doesn't form citizens. It forms repeaters. This is the kind of education that produces functional stupidity. People who know formulas, rules, and procedures, but don't know how to question reality. People who learned how to get the answer right on tests, but never learned how to ask questions. And a society full of people who don't ask questions is the dream of any authoritarian system. Literacy is more than the mechanical learning of reading and writing. It is the means to achieve a critical understanding of one's reality. Paulo Freire. Freire's proposal is the opposite. A problem-posing education that starts from the students' real lives, that listens to them, challenges them, and invites them to think. An education that doesn't teach what to think, but how to think. And even more, why to think. This process requires what Freire calls the move from naive consciousness to critical consciousness. Naive consciousness is the mindset that naturalizes the world as it is. It believes poverty is the poor people's fault, that inequality is inevitable, that the country's problems are solved with order and silence. It's a consciousness that accepts the dominant narrative without reflecting, that repeats ready-made phrases, that distrusts anyone who questions too much. It's not stupidity in the technical sense, but it is a cultivated, trained, functional stupidity. Because the person might be excellent at math or grammar, but is unable to see what lies behind appearances. And here is the heart of Freire's critique. When education doesn't free people, it infantilizes them. It creates adults who behave like obedient children, who don't dare say no, who need orders, bosses, leaders to think for them. When education is not liberating, the dream of the oppressed is to become the oppressor. Paulo Freire. This line reveals another trap of alienating education. It not only fails to fight oppression, it reproduces it inside the minds and hearts of those who receive it. It teaches people to love the oppressor, to imitate the oppressor, to want to be the oppressor, as if the problem were just switching places and not changing the structure itself. Freire speaks to the poor, the marginalized, the forgotten, but his critique applies to all of us. How many times do we repeat ideas without thinking? How many times do we call normal something that is actually an unjust social construction? How many times do we applaud stupidity dressed up as authority just because we were taught not to challenge it? And more, how many times did school itself teach us to be afraid of making mistakes? Not to raise our hand, not to stand out, to only speak when we know the right answer. How many times were we punished for thinking differently, for having our own opinion, for questioning the system? Paulo Freire believed that teaching is an act of courage, and learning is too, because real knowledge destabilizes us. It pushes us out of our comfort zone. It forces us to see that the world could be different. It makes us realize that we're not just spectators, we're agents. And that's scary, because once we accept that we can change the world, we also accept responsibility for it. It's much easier to say, it's always been like this. It's easier to teach obedience than awareness. That's why stupidity is useful. For those who want to hold on to power, it's much more convenient to shape obedient subjects than critical citizens. And banking education, in that sense, is perfect. It trains, molds, and controls. But it doesn't free. No one educates anyone else. No one educates themselves alone. People educate each other in communion. Paulo Freire. This is the pedagogy of listening, of dialogue, of exchange, of mutual respect. An education where the teacher is not the owner of truth, but someone who provokes consciousness. Where the student is not passive, but the main actor in their own learning. Where knowledge is not an end in itself, but a path to transform reality. Paulo Freire's pedagogy is not a utopia. It's urgent. In a time when misinformation spreads like a virus, when authoritarian speeches are gaining strength again, when critical thinking is treated as a threat, it has never been more important to talk about liberating education. Because stupidity is not just a lack of data, it's the refusal to think. And schools, universities, and every learning space cannot be complicit in that. They can't go on producing people who get informed but never get transformed. An education that teaches people to obey without thinking is not neutral. It's harmful. It shapes people who follow orders but don't recognize injustice, who can recite laws but don't feel compassion, who repeat manuals but don't see other people's pain. The clarity Freire proposes is a loving clarity, one that unites thought and action, that refuses the arrogance of those who know everything and values the knowledge that comes from people's lives, experience, and everyday reality. One that understands that a real teacher is someone who also learns from their students. And above all, one that understands that educating is a political act. It always has been. It always will be. Because education doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in a world full of inequality, injustice, conflict, and hope. Knowledge only exists through invention and reinvention, through the restless, impatient, continuing, hopeful inquiry human beings pursue in the world, and with each other. Paulo Freire. So, either we educate for clarity, or we become accomplices in programmed stupidity. Thank you sincerely for staying with me until the end. If these reflections made sense to you or sparked important questions, consider sharing this video. Sometimes a single well-placed idea can be the starting point for a deep change, personal or collective. If you're not subscribed to the channel yet, I invite you to subscribe and turn on notifications. That way, you can follow the new content regularly, always with depth, seriousness, and a real commitment to critical thinking. Leave your comment below. Your perspective can expand the conversation and make this space of reflection even richer. And if you feel this content deserves to reach more people, leave a like. It helps the video reach others who are also looking for a more attentive and conscious way of seeing the world. feel free to explore the other videos on the channel. There's still a lot to think about, and maybe a lot to unlearn. See you in the next one.